So, Tolkien is out now. This is the biopic about, conveniently, J.R.R. Tolkien. It's out in theaters now. You can go see it. But I've been asked for my thoughts quite a bit because I am a known Tolkien guy. And this is something that I'm not sure that we'll get to on the podcast. And so I thought I'd throw together my thoughts on this YouTube video for you guys. If you have any questions, obviously hit the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them there. But here are a few minutes worth of my thoughts on the movie. Now, this is part review and part response. There are a lot of reviews out there with which I disagree. I really liked the movie. Not everyone did. But there was one kind of egregious review that stated, "The man himself, along with the male-dominated times that made him, should stay a footnote." Well, we'll get there in just a moment. So first things first, just to kind of explain what the film is and kind of how it feels, this is a really, really small, intimate movie. This is not how The Lord of the Rings was made. This was not John Ronald's experience in the World War I trenches, although that does figure into it. But it's really two stories, both very small, both very intimate. One is the story of the TCBS, the Tea Club and Barovian Society, and the other is how Ronald and Edith met and what they meant to each other. So kind of two love stories, honestly, but it's two very different kinds of love. One is romantic love with Edith, but the other is the love of friendship or fellowship, obviously, as the word gets thrown around in the movie a little bit. So it's two love stories, and both of them, I think, are very effective. But this is sort of a problem for me, with any review that I might give, because I'm so close to the source material, not not familially or geographically, but I just mean that I've been studying The Lord of the Rings and, by extension, Tolkien himself for years and years, and I've become really attached not just to the stories that he wrote, but the story of the man himself, not because of his, grandiose deeds or anything like that, but because he was a simple man who did extraordinary things. So anyway, I'll get to all that in a moment, but let's talk a little bit more about the movie itself. So when it comes to this movie, I kind of feel a little bit like when I originally saw Harry Potter 5 in the theaters. I hated it. I thought it was really bad, but it was a bad movie qua movie. It didn't accomplish what I thought a movie should do. But for some diehard Harry Potter fans, it was everything they wanted and more, because you had all the scenes from the book that were your favorites just kind of filmed and put together, on screen. And so I didn't think that it was a really effective story, but all your favorite scenes were there with the Hagrid's brother and the fireworks in the Great Hall and all this stuff. And so it had all of that going for it. So I do wonder sometimes if a similar thing is at play for me here, because I know Tolkien's story so well, and because I feel so emotionally connected to it. Was it just nice for me to see it all put on screen? I'm not sure. I get the sense, though, that this isn't really the way it is, because I went and saw it with my wife, who is not a Tolkien buff at all. And she came out of it with much the same feeling that I did, that it was, she connected with it emotionally, that she really appreciated the stories that were being told. She wasn't there to see how The Lord of the Rings was made or anything like that. So I think having no expectations on her part made it maybe more enjoyable than somebody who's going in with The Lord of the Rings in mind, if that makes sense. Anyway, in the movie itself, as far as the performances go, I didn't see any weak performances. Nicholas Hoult plays Tolkien quite well. Lily Collins plays Edith quite well. That one's tricky because we know so little about Edith at that age. We can extrapolate a little bit. There are hints here and there, but we don't have the same kind of access to records that we do with Ronald on the other side. And so she did a great job. I liked her performance. The only problem is I don't know if I can judge, how closely she resembled Edith in real life. No way to know. As far as the things that are on screen, though, I do really enjoy them. I thought the TCBS scenes were just a joy to watch. The romance, the courtship with Edith is an absolute delight. And there were a few changes to the timeline that I noticed, the way that their relationship actually played out, the way that things went. And I didn't really mind those, honestly. I knew that there would be some timeline changes just because you can't quite tell the story. It's like adapting a book, frankly. If you tell the story as it is on the page, it's not going to quite work the way that you want it to, as far as, building tension or telling a narrative the way that we're used to having stories told. So I knew there would be some changes, and I was ready to forgive that. And I'm glad I was, honestly. Dome Karakowski is the Finnish director. He shoots it lovingly and skillfully. It looks great. It feels great. It doesn't feel like a tiny, small biopic. It does kind of feel grand, even though the subject matter is quite small. I do have some complaints. There are a few clunky moments. There's a made-up scene where Ronald and Edith are kind of they try to go to the opera and they can't get in, and so instead they sneak into the basement and kind of listen to Wagner through the open door while they play with all of the costumes and stuff, and it's all kind of childish and weird. So that scene felt a little bit clunky to me. There were a few editing choices that I thought were strange. The big complaint that I have, and that I know a lot of other people have, is the lack of Catholicism in the movie. You do have Father Morgan, his legal guardian after his mother dies, and so he's obviously a Catholic priest, and so Ronald is obviously involved with the Catholic Church, but not much is made of it. Now, there is some excuse for that, in that Tolkien said later in life that at that point, as a young man, he said he was a bad Catholic. If he went to Mass, it was infrequently, etc., etc., all the things that you would expect of, somebody in their late teens. But that being said, it was still a force in his life. So yeah, I might have liked to see a little bit more on the Catholic side of things, but I'm willing to forgive that because I don't know how I would have put it in there. So by concentrating on the TCBS and the Edith stuff, it's nice at least that the movie is really focused on those things. It's not necessarily trying to give you a holistic picture of Tolkien at that age or as a man, but it does give you at least those two kind of snapshots in his life: the courtship of Edith and the formation and the death of the TCBS. And speaking of changes like that, there's been a lot of hullabaloo made of the fact that the Tolkien Estate kind of disavowed the movie, or I don't know if disavowed is the right word, but they did not endorse. We do not endorse anything or support anything in this film. And a lot of hay has been made about that. I'm not sure that I give it much credit because, frankly, the Tolkien Estate, from what I understand, and look, I'm an imperfect observer on this, but they don't care for much of anything when it comes to their grandfather's legacy. So it's hard for me to get real worked up about that. They refused to endorse the Lord of the Rings films. They refused to endorse the Hobbit films. That one's probably okay. So yeah, I don't really care too much about that. But now I want to get back to what I was talking about earlier, where, yeah, it's part review of the film, but part response to the critical responses, and what somebody like myself, who is really invested in the story of Tolkien, the man, what I think of the movie and what I think of how other people are talking about it. So there was a piece in Wired magazine. The writer's name is Emma Gray Ellis. Now, the headline, and understand, writers don't pick their headlines, generally speaking. They don't write their own headlines, and so take this with a grain of salt. But the headline is, Tolkien proves that hobbits were more important than the man. I find this wildly offensive. So there's a line in the review, it's kind of later on in the review, where she writes, "Stripped of glamour, Tolkien just looks like a relatively ordinary British man who goes to war and marries the girl next door." Well, yeah. That's kind of the point. Now, first of all, what glamour? I mean, the man was never terribly glamorous, even if he did write the most celebrated book of the 20th century. But the thing is, this is kind of the point. Yes, he was an ordinary guy who got shipped off to war, came home, married the girl next door, and lived a completely ordinary life. There's something to this idea that an ordinary person did something extraordinary and changed the world. Hang on a second. Where have I seen this before?
Even the smallest person can change the course of the future.
I mean, speaking for the relatively normal men of the world, it's really nice to have a role model like this who isn't necessarily outwardly extraordinary. I mean, this is going to be bookended by last year's Freddie Mercury biopic, and later this year there will be one on Elton John. You know, and these musicians were larger than life. They're huge and bombastic, and that's not something that I can really relate with. So yeah, it's kind of nice that Tolkien is just a normal guy who ends up doing something extraordinary. That's more impactful for me than it would otherwise be. If you want to say that his life is boring or simple, I would have no problem with that. It was kind of. But, you know, as somebody once said,
it is no bad thing to celebrate a simple life.
And finally, returning to that review, the review closes with this line. The man himself, along with the male-dominated times that made him, should stay a footnote. Well, I think this is pretty offensive, honestly, to reduce an entire man's life to just a footnote to that book that he wrote. That's all that we care about is just that book that he wrote. I think there's a lot to be had from Tolkien's life. Obviously, I mean, there's a reason that I keep going back to his biographies and his letters. Now, as for the times, there are plenty of things that I'm glad that we left in Edwardian England. But I think there are things that we can appreciate and try to emulate. For one thing, there's the sense of duty that Tolkien had, and this is hinted at in the movie. I do wish, though, that it had come out just a little bit more than what we got. But the other thing is the idea of male friendships, strong, emotional male friendships. That's something that I think has kind of fallen by the wayside in our time that I would love to have back. This idea of an emotional, deep connection between male friends, which is more difficult now to achieve than it was back then. So, do I recommend it? Yes, I definitely recommend it. I think the movie is worthy of more than the few $1 million that it's projected to get at the box office. I think it's projected to get $3 million in the first weekend. I guess we'll see how that goes. But I do think it's worthy of seeing it on the big screen if you're able. If you're not able to, what's most important is that you see it. So when it comes out on video on demand, or if you want to get it on DVD or something like that, that's fine. Anyway, if you do see the movie, what I hope it does is that it sparks some kind of emotional connection with the man himself. It's not going to give you a perfect understanding of the timeline of his life and exactly how things went calendar-wise, you know, with how he met Edith or whatever. But what it might do is give you that connection with him as a person and make you want to go out and read Humphrey Carpenter's biography or John Garth's biography. These are great resources that I have loved. Go read his letters. They're fantastic, and you learn a lot about him that way. So that's what I hope the movie does, kind of like The Lord of the Rings did for people, where they saw it and they said, hey, that was really cool. I think I'll go read the books. Turns out the books are a little bit different, but you go love those instead, you know, or along with. And so I think that's what you could do with this movie as well. Anyway, I've rambled long enough. Let me know what you guys think. Obviously, hit the comments below, and I'll be happy to chat with you there as much as I can. Thanks for watching, guys. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast if you haven't yet. If you go to our homepage, you can still access the Lord of the Rings series that we did, in 2014. So those are available there, but they are old enough now that they've disappeared from the RSS feed, so you won't find them on iTunes and that sort of thing. And if you want to support us and what we do, I'll put a link to our Patreon in the description below, so you can hit that up. If you prefer a one-time donation, we do PayPal as well, so that would be much appreciated. But really, honestly, I just appreciate you guys watching and listening to the podcast if you do that. So thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.